So let me begin by asking what in fact is the countryside and where is rural Europe? These are not easy questions to answer. When we speak of the countryside, are we referring to a place where there is a predominance of specific occupations or class configurations? Or are we talking about different cultural attitudes? Where does rural Europe end and begin? Are these solely spatial configurations defined by density or by location, characterized by a different relationship to the environment, perhaps? Or are we talking about different allegiances or obligations? What kinds of expectations do we have of these communities, and what obligations do we have to them? There are long-standing views of rural communities as homogeneous, isolated, static. Yet as the papers have demonstrated, the physical landscape is anything but static or fixed. Far from being isolated, residents are skilled and successful in making demands on EU funding. Others work hard to salvage local traditions in the face of migration and environmental degradation, while still others, outsiders to rural communities, find inspirations in times past in our work. So I would like to tackle or address three specific concerns that I bring from my own work. The first would be dealing with the social complexity of rural communities. The second would be working over the landscape, issues of the physicality. And finally, the ideology or the reach of the state. And I will do so by recounting anecdotes from my fieldwork and historical episodes that I've run across in the process of my archival work on the 19th and 20th centuries. I'm, after all, an anthropologist, and we always tell stories. So first, let me present my credentials. I have conducted two kinds of research on agrarian communities in Hungary. I lived in a village for 2 years between 1982 and 1984 in Hungary, which is classic participant observation. And then I've done extensive archival work on the 19th and 20th centuries. So when I went to the field, my field work was essentially structured by the question, was Marx right when he said that if you change the relations of production, people's attitudes changed? Or, put in a more kind of pragmatic sense, how did the Socialist Party state of Hungary go about trying to change people's ideas of themselves and of their communities by forcing them to surrender their land and labor to collectivized production? The simple answer was, of course, yes, attitudes about land and labor and community changed, substantially altered, but not in fact in the way that the Communist Party had envisioned or had hoped. In place of these proudly collectivist-minded workers, I found villagers who prized individualism, they embraced instrumentality, and repudiated all forms of Communist Party ideology. Freddy Bacci, Uncle Frank, my favorite guy in the village, I said, I'm a member of the stomach party, just leave me alone. So I won't go into the rest of that analysis. That's about in my book, but I will discuss a bit about the field work. So I'm studying work, and it is important to me, in that sense, to be a true participant. The village that I did field work in was approximately 3,000 people, and I took every opportunity I could to work with people. Right? When I was working on the cooperative farm, I only hoed crops. I worked with the women's brigade. They wouldn't let me do much else. I went to the machine shop, but they wouldn't let me do anything there. I wasn't going to hang out at the dairy guy. They get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and then they go out in the field and sleep all day. So I had, I focused primarily on managerial activities and what people were doing, which things that I could do as well. And then when I was at people's houses, I took every opportunity to work too. So I would help hoe the tomatoes in the backyard, or I would help pick tobacco, which is a local cash crop, sew it together, harvesting fruit. It's just, and it was a good thing to do because, although I didn't know this at the time, that was essentially the way to assert your humanity, that in fact you worked and you respected people who worked. I was very keen to also focus primarily on the labor relations of the village, because of course I'm talking about the labor with collectivization. The problem is that most of the scholarship on Hungarian rural communities focused on people who own land, right? In that sense, they were peasants, right? People who owned land had their own farm. But let me give you a quick set of numbers. In 1939, 75% of farms in Hungary were smaller than 5 acres. So 3 acres, you can imagine, that's very small. and they covered only 1/10 of the land under cultivation. So you see very few people had any amount of land whatsoever. 38% of the land was distributed among 0.15% the total number of farms. These were large manorial estates. You can think about it as latifundia or plantations owned by the Catholic Church or by wealthy people. So you'd have 10,000 acres here, 50,000 acres there. These were huge, what we would think of as plantations. Right? And if you wanted to define self-supporting farms, let's say those between 50 and 100 acres, they were only about 1% of the land. So what this means is that this was a region that was primarily, it's California agriculture. It's this large-scale agriculture that was not characteristic of these small farms that often people thought. So, and of course this is a little bit unusual because many of the countries in Eastern Europe had had land reform before, right after World War I, but not in Hungary. The village that I chose to do fieldwork in was located in the region that had the highest proportion of manorial production in the county. 61% of the land was owned by wealthy landowners. It just so happened to be the best land in the country, so you can imagine why they snapped it up. And what this meant is, of course, that many people who lived in the village had not ever worked in family farms. They hadn't worked with a few people in the family. They'd always lived at these settlements where you'd have 50 families here, 10 families there, scattered across the plantation. And they didn't have the experience. They had essentially worked in collective production before the war, right? So when it came to collectivization, their experience did not radically change. It wasn't a shift from family production to, in fact, a big, large group. It was much more continuity between the manorial estate and the collective farm. So in terms of archival work, I've spent a lot of time looking at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, so I've written about 19th century agrarian communities. I spent a lot of time reading newspapers in the 19th century, contemporary accounts, looking very much at the gradual loss of land. I'll be talking about this a little bit later in my talk. Among serfs, what you would call the classic Leninist road, that people who did acquire land after the abolition of serfdom in 1848 started with, because of part of inheritance, to lose their land. They had to divide it among their children, and so by the turn of the 20th century, many of them were very poor and had very little land at all, and were forced to partake in what they called the new corvée, which was additional work beyond the field work that they had to do just to be able to get a job. In terms of 20th century, I also studied gender and nationalism. I've looked at state formation, cadastral surveys, labor laws. I'll talk about some of this as I go. In terms of my 20th century work, I studied agrarian economists and work scientists in the interwar period. Looked at issues of price indices and living standards in relationship to work I did on calorie money, which is a form of money they used during the inflationary period. And I looked at inflation at both after World War I and World War II. And right now I'm working on a book on satirical magazines published by political parties, but that's a fun project. So in other words, my familiarity with the countryside is a focus primarily what I would call political economy broadly construed, by which I mean that capitalism and socialism, of course, are historical and cultural processes. Right? They're always necessarily historical, and therefore you have to analyze them as such. So let me turn then to the first of my concerns, which would, what I mentioned is the complexity of rural communities. As you, I'm sure, know, Marx quipped about the peasants that they were essentially like a sack of potatoes. You know, this is this image, the homogeneity, stupid, inert actors, right? A couple of people who are members of the nation, but they don't constitute a class. This is this very classic position, right? And many Hungarian ethnographers, before the war and even in the socialist period, would talk primarily about villages as if they were relatively homogeneous. They might recognize a little bit of difference in terms of whether people had long-standing titles to land because of certain aristocratic definitions. You know, you could have aristocratic designation and be, you know, they're poor, but there were these differences. But there wasn't much attention to the variety of differentiation, right? So, the numbers I cited before, 2/3 of the agrarian population in Hungary prior to the Second World War were landless, or just maybe had 1 acre or 2. right? And very famous conservative social critics said in 1927 that Hungary was the country of 3 million beggars. So the image of Hungary as having this cute little peasantry running around and producing food and everyone having, eating eggs and milk was completely it was a misrepresentation. So when I started my fieldwork, I wanted to find out what were in fact the gradations that there existed between different groups in the community if I didn't look just at property relations, right? So I started to look at the way in which people define themselves in terms of the way that they worked. And particularly to understand how those people who were poor, who didn't have land, were classified in terms of local categories, right? Now, one of the wealthiest families in the village that I did fieldwork in had 12 acres. That tells you how poor this village was, right? This was, and they were able to sustain themselves, feed their family, and do very well, right? So the assumption was that those who were able to sustain themselves, provide for their families, or what they said called masters of their own domain, those were what you considered respectable members of the community. People who were self-sufficient, who didn't have to rely on anyone else to get by. They might not have been rich, but at least they were self-sufficient, and they had integrity. The rest of the people in the community always were relying on other people for a certain amount of work, right? So if you didn't have enough land to provide for your family, you would often then engage in harvesting in the summer. For example, with large manorial estate, you didn't do migrant work, you just went out to the harvest, the wheat harvest, and cut a bunch and got a certain proportion. And that would allow you to get through the year, right? So they were a little bit less human, or had a little bit less integrity, right? And then you had what were essentially day laborers, people who never had enough money to do anything. They didn't have enough land, they might not have had any land at all, and all they did was work on these daily tasks, right? From they'd go to one peasant house to do this, they might go out to the manor and take on a couple of tasks there, right? But they were also looked down upon precisely because they're even less in control of their own labor, right? And then you also had migrant laborers who came from other parts of the country, right? So I was in Feher County, which is right in the middle. Migrant laborers came from areas where these people might have had much more land than people in the village where I did fieldwork, but the land wasn't good enough quality to provide for them. So they would come down in the summer and they'd do all the row crops, right? They'd plant and hoe potatoes and tomatoes and sugar beets and so on, and they would be there for a whole 6 months, and then they'd take a portion of that food back home. And they were often treated as, kind of really foreigners. They were people who were outside the village. They were housed in the sheep barns. They're often talked about as being sexually promiscuous and so on. But at the very bottom, the lowest of the lower manorial workers, these are people who lived out on the plantation, out on these latifundia, in these little scattered settlements. And you have 5,000 acres here, 5,000 acres there. They would be given a yearly contract, which allowed them to get so many grains to be able to feed their family, some lard. They would have access to a small garden plot. They might get a pair of boots every other year. And if they were lucky, they could keep a cow because then they would have milk. But you can see they worked primarily in kind. It was only the day laborers in the community that worked for cash. They're the only people who had handled cash in any regular fashion whatsoever. So these day laborers lived in very unpleasant circumstances. They often lived in, it's a room of 12 by 12 feet, and there would be 4 families in the room, one in each corner, right? So everybody would sleep and live. And then in the middle, they'd have 2 sets of those rooms. In the middle, they would have a kitchen where everyone would cook. And I remember reading in one account, he said, well, some people say that there's not enough oxygen in the room, but I think the concern should be moisture in the walls. And if you're starting to get to that point, it was already clear before the First World War that these housing stock was inappropriate. By 1921, they were considered against the Geneva Convention, but no one did anything about it. So these people lived in very unpleasant places. Now, of course, in the manorial estates, you also had some skilled workers. You had cartwrights or blacksmiths, so there was a little bit more diversity on the manorial estate, right? And these were to be people who would associate with skilled workers in the town. Right? So they'd go into the pub, and in the village you'd have a pub where the landowning peasants frequented, the pub where the skilled workers went, where they had moving pictures, and then there would be a pub that where the very poor people of the town lived. And of course, you also had some Jews. One store was owned by a Jewish family. There were several peasant families who were Jewish, who kept land, and then of course the person who owned the land that was the closest, 5,000-acre plot, was also a Jew, a woman who was married to a very important industrialist in the workers. So they had a presence, but not necessarily a very big one. And of course, Count Esterhazy, who had a little castle. It was a little, I mean, you had, I don't know, it was a building that maybe had, I don't know, 30 rooms or something, but it wasn't a big place. And he wouldn't be down in the village that often, but he could come down for it. And there were, of course, servants in the house. So to show you already there's a very great diversity in the number of people who are living in this village, who related to whom, how. There was a very small community of Roma at that point, who grew up more after the war. They weren't very prominent. And it's exactly this kind of social complexity that I didn't find ever in the ethnographies that I was reading, that you have these fine gradations, just the degree to which you couldn't control your own labor would make all the difference in the world. Right? So let me recount one of my favorite anecdotes from the field. I was very lucky early on when I was in the village to meet Uncle Frank Feribaci, very smartest guy in the village, I think. He had 3 years of education, but he also was luckily enough, even though he wasn't a soldier, to spend 3 years in Siberia after, between 45 and 48. We picked him up off the street. Very, very smart, very interesting guy. So I used to hang out at his house a lot, right? So we're sitting watching TV one night, and on the news, they say, well, Bölöni, they started talking about this literary critic, Bölöni. They say, well, he focused his work on Adi, but later he became a socialist in the 1920s and 30s. And Feribaci turned to me and goes, there were no socialists then. They're always trying to push it back. They're always trying to make it. I thought, I wrote a whole master's thesis about the way in which the Communist Party used history, right? And so here he's just saying toss-off comment. He goes, if there had been socialists, my father would have been a socialist, he said. So in 1928, when his youngest brother was born, his father, Feribaci's father, went to the steward to tell him that he had a son. And stewards were notorious for treating the people that worked in the Mineral Estates very, very poorly. So he said to him, well, I guess the crown prince has been born. And Uncle Frank's father said, if I knew that my son was going to have the life that I've lived, I'd wring his neck right now. Now, of course, he could have gotten in trouble with the steward, except that he and Esterhazy were buddies because they'd served together in the First World War in the leather unit. And so making belts. So he really couldn't kick out this guy because he was friends with the Count. And in fact, in the socialist period, Esterhazy actually made his living by making belts. So he had some activities to do. Right? So you see this kind of the dismal conditions under which people lived and the kind of humiliation they were subject to. But not everybody was so brave. So for example, I learned that the person I often referred to as the evil party secretary in the village, who was a very nasty man, his father was a work boss on the manor. And at one point in the interwar period, the steward asked him to send his daughter up to his house for the evening. And he did so. He prostituted his own daughter so that he wouldn't lose his job. So there are people who were willing to go to that extreme length also to keep their position. Now, it was always very funny because the evil party secretary said that his father was a 1919 communist. Everybody in the village knew he was a work boss, right? I mean, it's just stupid when you live in a small place like that. But anyway, he didn't have a good reputation for having prostituted. And she actually got pregnant, never got married, so it's kind of not a pleasant story. So the powerful stories about exploitation of the manor extend far beyond just living conditions, right, and long work hours, right? People who lived on the manor would do anything in their power to save a few pennies to be able to move into town. Because people in the village treated manorial workers like animals. They didn't consider them human, right? They, wouldn't deign to talk to them, right? So people would do their very, very best, and they chose insecurity if they could move into the town, into the village to do that. So this very stark hierarchy that I've described, the inequality among villagers is very clear. But it was very interesting, and what surprised me was there was not a direct relationship between how much land one owned, right, or how wealthy one was, and one's relationship to the market or one's relationship to money. In fact, the more money, the wealthier you are, the less you engage in monetary transactions. So, and this was pointed out to me by an anecdote that I heard from a woman. I stayed with her family for about 6 months when I first moved to the village. Her family was the wealthiest family in town. They had, I don't know, 25 to 12 acres or so. And their house was right across from the marketplace. And she said to me that one day she saw a woman she knew to be a day laborer buying herself a pair of red shoes. And she was so envious of this woman because she knew she'd never, ever pick a pair of red shoes. Because every single penny that came into that house went into the box that would allow them to buy more land. She never had access to any cash, and she felt this kind of, she was essentially completely beholden or controlled by her family. She would never have the ability to allow herself to have beautiful things because everything went into the So what this means is, so wealthier peasants maybe engaged, maybe had a little cash if they sold things at the local market, but generally they traded, right? They took their surplus wheat, or they took their extra pigs, and they traded those at the fair. Poor families would also pay in kind. They would take so many eggs or milk. They often didn't eat their own eggs or milk. They'd take them to the store to buy petroleum or matches and things like that, right? And then, of course, and it was only the day laborers who had any relationship with cash. This is a very different kind of image of what we think, very different understanding of what the market. So being privy to people's memories of the past enabled me to paint a much more realistic picture of life as lived than I had gathered from a lot of written accounts in ethnography. So let's then turn to a second concern, which is working over the landscape, or treating the material environment of the landscape as a pliant participant, right? Several of the papers are talking about the way in which people had modified in ancient Rome, the Romans had modified land. This is a very common story. So, and in rural communities, the whole question of who has rights to land, who has access to land, and what they do with it was a continuing question. And also, not just whether they have access to land, but whether their rights were recognized or not. Whether they had actually written documents saying that their family had always owned that terrace, for example. And sometimes, of course, there were disputes about where the plot actually was within the village, right? In what section and who belonged. So these were subject to all kinds of serious debates. You may know Catherine Verdery's very excellent monograph she wrote about decollectivization of Romania called The Vanishing Nectar, and which showed this whole process very powerfully, right? What happened? The question was, when the collective farms were being dismantled, who would get their land and where it wasn't? And there were extensive debates, fights actually in the village, about who owned what property, what land. And it wasn't just that some people had land titles, they had documents, and other people didn't. And they'd say, but you know that my grandfather worked this land. You know that was the land. So sometimes it was an issue of documentation. But it was also by virtue of the fact that the landscape had changed. They plowed, made big open fields that were good for weed production, right? So they got rid of trees or bushes or any other kind of landmark that would tell you where the land was. Rivers had shifted their, right? So there was something that people couldn't, in fact, identify the same border. Right? So it wasn't just paperwork and it wasn't just land titles or memory. The physical landscape had changed and made it extremely difficult for people to lay claim to their titles. And then a much more common problem was that some people had greater influence in the courts than others, right? They could bribe the judges or they could bribe the lawyers, and they were able to assert claims that in fact they had no right to. But it's an excellent book if you ever have a chance to read it, because it tells you so much about that whole process. But obviously, collectivization was not the first time you had this major shift in the character of land and the way in which people had right to land, right? If we look back to the 19th century, it was very common in many, many places across the globe that you had states intervening or private corporations changing the land, building railroads, right? Rerouting rivers, draining marshes. This is a very extensive process. When people in Hungary used to say, oh, there was no state intervention before socialism, it's like, I think you don't know the history of your own country. So the state would come in and do all kinds of major projects to make more land arable, right, so that you'd have more land for cultivation. You have irrigation channels, all kinds of things. And in fact, there's one, and these were it was intended, as I said, to bring more arable land, but also to ease transportation across the country. And they could have enormous social consequences. There was a region in Hungary, lower part of the Danube, that had always lived off fishing. And all the marshes were drained. And they were all of a sudden bequeathed this extremely rich land. And within one generation, their daughters were ordering silk from Paris. Right? They became so wealthy because of the way in which they got that land. But in other cases, of course, people lost their land. So, but of course, a far more substantial change was the abolition of serfdom, right? When titles to land were transferred, right? Now, our general assumption is that when serfdom was abolished in 1848 in Hungary, that everyone who had been a serf would have gotten a certain amount of land by virtue of their having worked for the Lord, right? But in fact, this was not the case at all. So prior to the 19th century, most rights to land were urbarial, which is a term which refers to the fact that you have rights to work the land, right? You have usufruct rights. And you have usufruct rights in relationship to the lord who owns the land, right? So that's very straightforward. And the serf also had rights to land to work. But unbeknownst to a lot of people, in the 1820s and 1830s, a number of wealthy aristocrats started to redefine the nature of their property holdings and made them allodial, which meant that they became outright wealth. That their children could inherit, and they were outright pieces of property, which had not existed prior to that. People didn't own property in that same sense prior to this period, right? And what happened was, in 1848, a good number, 2/5 of the people who were serfs, didn't get any land whatsoever because they found themselves on these allodial properties. And the people said, I own this land. You have no right to leave. You have to continue to work for me, right? So what you find is this huge, the next 2 decades, I mean, this is 1848-49, there's a huge war of independence against the Habsburg crown, so that is defeated. And between the 50s and primarily in the 60s, you have huge legal suits that continue for a decade over whether serfs have right to land or whether they don't have right to land. Right? So there this one more time, that same set of issues of who has right to have access to land and who doesn't. Now, at approximately the same time, the young Emperor Franz Joseph initiated a cadastral survey in 1853. Cadastral survey meaning he wanted to see how much land people owed so he could figure out how much tax they owed. And after 1848, aristocrats for the first time were obligated to pay tax as well as peasants. So that was kind of from their point of view, kind of a bummer. So what he did was he sent out this group of people to do a 10-day quick survey to find out and to establish what was the character of the land in all these regions. So they had 7 categories. So was it vineyards, which of course were more, you didn't have to have much land to have it very wealthy. Was it grains? Was it marsh? Was it forest? So everybody had to fill out a form designating or indicating what kinds of land that they had. Right? And of course they were able to do this and enforce this because they quashed the War of Independence. Now, the initial survey only lasted 10 years. The survey that was supposed to be more substantial continued on until the First World War and was never actually finished. So you can imagine how big the project was. But then you have to start to see, okay, who got what kinds of values for their land and what determined what kind of value you had for your land, right? Because you could say that my land is vineyard or you could say it was marsh, but it's not sure that in fact that would be the case, right? So you might not be surprised that the officials that Franz Josef sent to the countryside were more apt to give those people who had supported the Habsburg crown in the War of Independence lower taxation values, and people who lived in counties that had fought against the Habsburg crown had much higher taxation rates. Right? So they had it moderated depending on their political allegiance. Aristocrats had much lower taxation rates than peasants had, right? And people often falsified how much land they had. So you can imagine this is this huge, confusing kind of array of land titles and the character, the quality of the land, right? And of course, one of the many ironies of this whole process is that these values assessed in 1853 were the basis for kulak designations during the Stalinist period. Right? So it was already not necessarily a very accurate definition of land. You'd worked it for 100 years, which meant that it changed too. And then, of course, it became the basis for kulak designations. And people living in the countryside didn't forget this. So it was generally believed that if you saw a blue light above a marsh, it was called a kind of a nightmare light, it was called, was assumed to be the soul of a civil engineer who had measured the land wrong and who was in purgatory for having screwed over the peasants. So you have this little blue light. It's a great image, because they did do that. So the legal problems with decollectivization in the 20th century that I mentioned in terms of Catherine's work, and the abolition of the serfdom in the 19th century focused on legal title. But in the 1950s, you find another whole battle over the character of land and people who have rights to land. But then, in that case, it's not fought on the basis of property ownership, but on the basis of who worked the land and for how long. I was very surprised when I was reading for the book that the second of my quantification books, looked at documents at both a national level and at the county level in 3 different counties around the country. And they had these marvelous mood reports that I loved to read. And I was very surprised among the documents from 53, 54 to find so many legal suits that were submitted to the local county authorities. Because one would not have thought, if people think about the Stalinist state in the 1950s, that people would have trusted the Stalinist state to adjudicate a legal claim. But in fact, there are a whole number of claims that were submitted to the thing. So what had happened in the situation now, as I said, many, many people have described the first collectivization effort in Hungary as a failure. It was a failure. 80% of the peasants never joined. They just refused to join outright, or they left their land fallow. So the general view is that nobody wanted to join collective farms, right? They didn't want to be in the state telling them what to do. So as I said, the standard line was that, but this didn't in fact take into account people who had been manorial workers, right? So these workers that nobody wrote about because they didn't own land had a very different profile, right? So many people who actively, pleased and were happy to join collective farms in 1949 were people who had been manorial workers, right? Who had been given land in the land form in 1945. Now, these manorial workers had primarily worked with livestock. They'd never run a farm. They had no experience running a farm. They had no hoes. They had no livestock. They had no way of being able to run a farm. And then there were 3 years of drought. So by 1948, they were in bad shape. And so when the state came along and said, well, you can work together, you can work in a group, then in fact they jumped at the chance. One, because they would finally be able, as a group, to work the land. And they would also say that, we do have, we are human. We are not animals. We're people that should be respected because we can work the land, and we'll prove it to you when we join the collective farm. But this group of people had a very different understanding about what entitles you to own land and why you should be able to own the land that you did. So between 49 and 53, there were very heavy taxations by the state, and a lot of people who did own land or had some livestock did eventually join. There's 20% of people who did eventually join cooperative farms, but not, under duress. They had no reason, they were not interested in doing it. But after Stalin died, there was this big, what is called a thaw. And there was a jump in interest in, making reforms. And so Imre Nagy, who was the prime minister, said that those people who had joined cooperative farms who didn't want to stay in those farms could leave. So what you find is a whole bunch of people, those people who had been landowning peasants, immediately say they're going to leave the cooperative farm and take their livestock. But the people who were manorial workers said, well, you can't take your livestock. We're not going to give you your land. And they go, what do you mean? That was our father's land. And they go, land belongs to the person who works it. This was the communist slogan. Land belongs to the person who works it. And they would say, but we poured our blood and our sweat into that land for generations. We buried our families' bones in that land. And they go, we poured our blood and sweat into the land. It just wasn't ours. So now we're going to say that you can't take that land and you can't take that livestock. And in fact, what happened is they had long debates that were around how much people had worked, how many days they worked in the cooperative farm. But it shows you that people had very different ideologies of who has right to land. If you work it, you have a right to it, and even if you inherited it. If you never worked it, you didn't have a right to it. So it was very interesting to see how actively so that the image that people have often said that the Communist Party tried to spur class warfare in the country, they said it never happened, but it did happen. It happened between the poor manorial workers, but not in 49, in 53 and 54, when the cooperative farms were endangered, when people, they didn't want the rest of the landowning peasants to leave because they worried it would be undermine their farm. And it suffice it to say, no cooperative farm made money at all during this time. They were constantly supported by the state. Private farmers were much more productive. But nonetheless, people were trying their best to stay in a cooperative farm. So having these people leave was really scary. If we jump now to the more current period, people's right to property or control of their own domain was also challenged. And this is under the conditions of joining the EU, or the harmonization process. People in Hungary, really were so excited with the end of socialism. They said, well, now we won't have a state telling us what to do. And then the EU shows up. Things change. And one of the most offensive regulations that the EU insisted upon was that villagers could not feed table scraps to their animals. Right? So people often had 1 or 2 pigs, they had chickens in their yard, and they would probably eat those animals. They might have an extra pig that they used to make sausage and sell in town, right? But the idea that you couldn't feed your own animals with the table scraps, they were just infuriated, right? These are our animals. How dare you tell us what we can do with them? And at that time, feed had also become very expensive because the state was not subsidizing it anymore. So the audacity of the EU just made them so angry. What do we mean by rule of law when you tell us that we can't even feed our pigs? And in fact, one of the factions in Hungary that was opposing joining the EU had posters all over the country of this emaciated pig. Well, look what they're going to do to us. They're going to starve us to death. There was actually an anthropologist in a column who said, we can't join. Have you ever eaten Swiss sausage? You'll die. It's not good sausage. So at about the same time there was a series of jokes going around, the angry little pig jokes. And they were a bit nonsensical. So for example, the elephant goes in the woods and he sees a pig in a little ditch and he says, angry little pig, what happened? I fell in. He says, well, just wait, I'm gonna go get help. I'm not waiting. Hungarians burst out laughing at that. I never found it funny. But the one that I really liked, and you'll have to excuse my language for this one. The angry little pig is walking in the forest and he meets the fairy, and the fairy says to him, you're so lucky, you have 3 wishes. He goes, I only have 1. And she goes, what? Fuck off! So this is all about, this intervention of the EU and all these, So there were a lot of very strong feelings about what was going on in terms of people's rights to control their own lives, even in what they thought was due. So then, let me turn then to my final theme, which is about the ideology and the reach of the state. So a month after I got to Sáros, the village where I did my fieldwork, it was May Day, so they had a little competition. The cooperative farm mounted this little competition, and all the men who worked at the cooperative farm went to that. All the women stayed home and did their ironing and all that kind of stuff. So Lotzi, who was the head of the cultural house, he said to the crowd, well, what do we celebrate on the 1st of May? And then he turns and says, Martha knows, she's from Chicago. But of course, being an American, I had nothing, I knew nothing about Haymarket market. You know, it's like, fuck, what am I going to do? What are they talking about, right? So they said, okay, what do we celebrate on the 1st of May? And this old guy goes, the beginning of spring? You know, this is 1982. How could he not know that May Day was a workers' holiday? So the idea that, in fact, you can have long periods of time in which people hear the same message again and again and again doesn't necessarily tell you that, in fact, they absorb that message or they take it to heart. The guy blew it off. He didn't care about the workers' holiday, right? So then there raises the question of how effective is the state in asserting its authority, and to what degree is it possible to, in fact, enroll people. In the Stalinist period, there was a lot of work being done constantly to try and encourage the peasants to, come to emotionally identify with the state. They didn't, but there was a lot of work going on because it was thought that they should do that, right? But of course, the state was not very effective in many respects in the Stalinist period. It didn't have the reach that it could have. A lot of the officials who were involved in it were very incompetent. And many people's experiences of the Stalinist period of this very anarchic and violent state. One quarter of all people who lived in the countryside were in jail between 1951 and 53 for things, offenses like not sweeping the sidewalk or not planting your seeds a little bit lower. The Soviets planted their seeds at 7 inches and the Hungarians at 3 or something, and they put these old people in jail. Right? And when Nod came to power, he freed 90,000 political prisoners. So this was a very violent state, right? But that doesn't mean it was necessarily an effective state in exercising its rule. Right? So I would read these marvelous mood reports that they submitted every week about what was going on in the countryside. And in one particular, I remember this agitator, he's been going out and trying to convince everybody that they should believe that, communism was going to be great. They should all join the big socialist campaign. So this guy shows up and he says, I'm telling you that Soviet agriculture is great. And the guy says, okay, all right, I believe you. Soviet agriculture is great, but why do I give a shit? He says, just leave us alone. Shoot me, go ahead, just shoot me. And I'm reading these documents and thinking, somebody who had the audacity to kind of speak like that to the agitator. So the guy kind of ran off with his tail between his legs. Or another example, this party secretary wrote a memo to the county seat. He says, just leave us alone, okay? Just leave us alone. We know what we're doing. Don't bother us. So you did not have what you would call a very effective state apparatus, right? There was a lot of places where people, and that's not surprising if you think about the fact that if you have a small group of people who are committed to the Communist Party in some sense in the city, developing ideology, they then send all the circulars, all the memos down to the local level, and the people there are supposed to follow through in policy, right? But they didn't necessarily have any commitment to the Communist Party, right? And they, in fact, had to actually put into practice all the ideological campaigns that the party was pursuing, but those weren't necessarily very clear either. So I remember in one of these, these county documents where they would they would have the conversation in the meeting written down in the notes, right? So there are always these questions about who's a kulak, why is that person a kulak? And in one case, this guy says, I don't quite understand the difference between isolating the kulak and liquidating him. So the guy was the head of the county seat said, it's very simple, he says, we don't want to liquidate them, we just want to drown them in their own blood. Right? So how do you follow through on that, right? What kind of policy is that telling them? It's completely confusing, right? You'd have, Mel was saying you guys haven't put up any names on the shame board, what is your problem? How come you're not on top of things, And of course, a lot of people didn't care, right? But as I said, this is anarchic, so you might go to jail for not doing that, but you might not go to jail for doing that. So the idea that this is all a systematic kind of thing is very problematic. Right? And of course, we know with 56 that, of course, a lot of people were not necessarily enamored of it. They might have been enamored of the Socialist project, they just weren't enamored of the Hungarian Communist Party. But let me contrast this effective state with that of Viktor Orban, who is a more recent dictator, as many of you who has built up a very effective state apparatus. Everyone is dependent on him. Everyone who's involved in his government is compromised, so he blackmails people and they stay in his government. And he has been very effective in reaching out to the countryside. Right? So leading up to the last election in April, a lot of people who lived in the city, the Prague Cafe folks, were looking forward to the possibility that maybe they could ally and get Orban out of power. But they weren't successful, unfortunately. And so after the election, people were very, very depressed because they saw that so many people in the countryside had voted for Orban. The problem, of course, was that people didn't necessarily vote for Orban because they believed in his populist message, right? It's that every single mayor in every single village in Hungary is a Fidesz, is a member of Orban's party. And there are very few employment opportunities in the countryside. And if you're very poor, you can get 40,000 forint a month. But if you're allowed to do public works, which is the mayor's decision who gets to do public works and who doesn't, then you get 60,000 forint, right? So lots of people voted for Fidesz, not because they had a commitment to the populist message, but because, in fact, it meant that they might be able to feed their families more effectively. Which tells us, which is a very sad commentary, that there's no secret ballot now in the countryside. This is exactly like the interwar period. There was a secret ballot in the city. The Social Democrats had a compromise, and they got a secret ballot in the city, but not in the countryside, and the same thing is true now. If you don't vote for Fidesz, you're never going to get any jobs working for the city, and it's the only way in many communities to be able to ever have some more money. So let me just then conclude. I haven't offered you more than just a few stories about land and labor and the law. But I hope that these anecdotes have conveyed in some small measure my belief that rural communities warrant more scrutiny. To just echo what John said this morning, these are very, very interesting and complex places, but they're very regularly ignored. And I think there are very important lessons we can learn about political, economic, and social complexities of rural life if we pay much more attention, if we actually engage with the people who are doing that. And perhaps we might be able to upset and become more critical of some of the assumptions that we bring to the study of rural communities.